let's get into it. Why do we need load to remodel tissue, increase the health of our tissue, rather than just beat it to death with a foam roller or lacrosse ball?
I think we have to, when we talk about this, we have to talk about it from like a biomechanical piece, physiological piece, and also from a neurological standpoint as well, right? So we're having a conversation right now. We're all talking. We've been talking all week to various people. We're using the English language to communicate to each other, okay? The body and the nervous system also use a language to communicate, but their language is force. It's load. It's stress. That's how we make adaptations. So when we go to something like a foam roller, for example, it's just not it's not a high enough stress load to make any significant changes. But then two, it's acting more on a neurological level anyway. Okay, so it's a big fancy term called descending noxious inhibitory control, DNIC.
Spelling?
Yeah, go for it.
No.
MISSISSIPP.
Yeah. So descending noxious inhibitory control, which the analogy I give people for this all the time is if you hit your knee off of a coffee table, what's your instinctual thing to do? Just kind of like rub it real hard to make it feel better?
Kick the coffee table.
Kick the coffee table back, break it.
Curse.
Lots of expletives.
Fucking throw it in the outside.
and the whole point of that is you're like scrambling nerve signals, right? And you're desensitizing those tissues. And so, for example, with the kicking your knee on the coffee table, it stimulated a lot of the deep receptors inside the tendon. And when you do that superficial rubbing, it just takes the brain attention and places it elsewhere. Okay, so that's essentially what foam rolling is doing. It's desensitizing the nervous system a little bit. But then we talk about the force and load structurally to the tissues in the body. I'm going to take this back with the common theme to Nick's thoracic extension deadlift, because I think it's a really great piece of awareness for these guys. It's a completely different stimulus, right, to their nervous system, to their body, where it's novel enough that it was, from a novel standpoint, the brain didn't know what to do with it. So it's already calling a lot more attention to it. It's paying more attention to it. It's going to take it a lot more seriously than the low load of going on a foam roller. But at the end of the day, like, muscles are really stupid in nature. They just respond and contract based on the positions of the joints. And if we keep using the upper back stiffness as our talking point here, a lot of these guys move the muscles concentrically, right? We don't do a whole lot of full lengthening and going through this excursion of an eccentric, hitting an isometric at that completely lengthened out state of the muscle, and then asking it to reverse that and contract and produce force out of that position. Okay, so that's when tissues are the healthiest, is when they can go through this excursion. We talked about it with the pelvic floor. We talked about it with the foot in pronation and supination, and the same thing with this upper back stiffness. So a lot of these guys get stiff there because they're constantly producing a concentric force with things like bench pressing and shoulder pressing, and then doing like a row or something from a very neutral center point position. And what Nick is doing is asking the thoracic spine to move through a full excursion and take all those parascapular muscles, all the muscles that go up and down the spine, and asking them to lengthen out fully, go to the isometric point, contract, and come back through center to a fully shortened point. And from a structural standpoint, now we're getting way more overlap at the actin and myosin and the muscles. We're creating full tension, compression, shear forces where they need to be onto the tendons. And you're creating a more holistic environment for movement at that point.
The one thing, when you guys did your pre-work and your prep and like kind of went through and evaluated everybody, there was this like universal, like everybody's got tight hips. And what was interesting is as we were squatting and once we were getting people into good position, teaching them good mechanics, knees track over the toes straight ahead, get into a position low in the squat where all of a sudden I was getting just to drive their knees out a little bit just to open it up. Everybody squatted way below parallel and squatted well to the point where people didn't look like they had tight hips, because that's something we encounter. And so was it the fact that their hips were tight because they didn't understand the mechanics? And going forward, now that we've effectively found their most true squat, getting to squat to that range of motion and actually using those new range of motions under load and active weights, will that effectively increase their hip mobility?
So 100%. And really that came back down to our discussion around the spine on our last day. And the first thing I did in that was demonstrate dissociative movement, right? And so basically the idea of moving various areas of your body rhythmically against each other. It takes about 10 seconds. It's a cool little party trick. The idea is all of a sudden you gain all this range of motion rapidly off of something that was completely unrelated to the task, right? And the whole thing comes down to the neurological system. And so our nervous system runs everything that's going to happen within the body. That's why training programs have to be used not at random, but based around what is the neurological integration for those movements. And so these guys, out of everybody we looked at, I want to say 99% had some report of low back pain. And out of that 99%, I think almost all of them were relatively excessively mobile in the lumbar spine, right?
Is it I'm just wondering if they have hypermobile lumbar spine, does the body naturally make the hips more rigid, more stiff, and then the upper back real stiff, because it's trying to almost like we can't have too many hypermobile joints?
Yeah, because these guys are going to do things in a loaded way. So I mean, like, you could probably look at somebody like a yogi or something like that doesn't necessarily carry the responsibility and load that these guys will. And they can be relatively mobile throughout their entire system without too much trouble. But these guys are applying a pretty good deal of load. So I would say it's
load,
kind of
rotation, shear, force. I mean, all these things.
Right. Compression and distraction, et cetera. But to me, that's kind of a chicken or the egg. Was the low back relatively mobile and then everything stiffened around it, or did everything stiffen around it and so therefore the low back has to be mobile?
I would go with the latter, because everybody's from a different background, and yet there was this commonality of like movement patterns and like things that we saw were unique to those like individuals. And so I would think that the function of the job, the training, whatever it is, ends up kind of maybe like highlighting these areas, or more importantly, kind of crystallizing them.
Yep. Well, and again, going back to this concept with the neurological system, if the brain perceives an area as being unknown, if I'm going into a movement that my brain does not recognize readily, or a range of motion that the brain doesn't necessarily recognize, it's going to react in such a way to create control and stability. And so the path of least resistance for control and stability is making musculature feel tight, right? Like Matt said, muscles are relatively simple. They can move shit and they can keep shit from moving. And that's pretty much it. And so our brain will use those in such a way to try to control joint.
It essentially comes down to safety and security at that point. If the brain feels like you're not safe moving into a particular range of motion, or you can't control that joint throughout that range of motion, like the hips, it will neurologically, like Nick said, give them a perception of something. And that perception of something can manifest in ways like pain, it can manifest in tightness, it can manifest in immobility. And that tightness feeling, in order to prevent them from going into a range of motion that they could potentially hurt themselves in. So it's more of a defensive mechanism. And like we should be happy that our brain is doing that, but then obviously it has these negative detrimental side effects. And if you actually watch all those guys squat in the beginning, Nick, I know you noticed this too, not one of them would get below 90 degrees.
Yeah.
Why? Because they are using all the flexion out of the hip, essentially just sitting into the heels,
sure,
and then flexing through the lumbar spine. And at that point, you've taken up all your range of motion. You can't create any torque and rotation. You're going to stop there every single time.
And what was amazing is when we got them into a position where their toes are forward, big toe was in the ground, more centered over the midfoot, knee came forward, getting them to drive their knees out, actually teaching them that neutral hip, good arrangement. Everything was, stacking in such a way. Instantly, everybody hit depth and squatted so much. Like, it was to the point where they were like, can we do another squat? It's never, or another set. It's never felt this good. Yeah. It's never been this easy.
Well, when we started having the conversation with them about how they were squatting, where they were training before, with the Hatfields, the way that they were doing them with the arms straight, they're effectively taking the flexibility out of the ankle. Mm-hmm. So if you eliminate that, and it shows up everywhere else within their training, right? So as we went into the speed work, the ankle motion was a major limitation.
Well, limitations for all. So we can get this out to a general perspective, and going back to the old CrossFit football seminar and why we default to toes forward.
Man, that was the best.
I
loved it.
Yes, going to the battle, people didn't understand when we then told them the purpose of setting up with our toes out to work around hip inflexibility, not loading the posterior chain as much, right? So we were able to now introduce purpose into this. This is a specific setup. All right, well, you as an individual need this direction, where John gave some knees out to not everybody, but the guys that needed it, that allowed them to then get lower.
Sure.
So I guess introduce this, Matt and Nick. No one way to do things. We can change setups to then target different pieces. It's not a squat is a squat, period. No. Setup changes things that in terms of activation, execution, and purpose.
Yeah, it depends what the intention is behind, like we said, with the movement. And then you couple that with their specific anthropometrics, so the way that they're built and their functional limitations, then we can start to tailor exactly what they need. Anyone's.
Yep. Not our guys. Anyone.
No, well, I mean, what's cool about the group we worked with is, I think that their movement characteristics are a function of their job, but nothing that they did was not characteristic of the population we look at. I mean, we had the opportunity to teach hundreds of seminars and train thousands of people across at football, to the point where we go in, we still could use the system to evaluate these guys. There were just unique patterns to them because of their job that were, that were just very connected with those individuals. And, but then also the model still fits. And, we typically see, people with poor dorsiflexion, and that doesn't, you can hide it in the squat, but when all of a sudden you start doing the sprint stuff, and especially a lot of the ankling and a lot of the things that we do within that warm-ups, it becomes super fucking bright to see.
And that's what I love about the toes forward, is it gives them a set point, like a center point to come back to each and every time. But then what we did the rest of the week too was, okay, here's the different ends of the spectrums that we can start to explore.
Sure.